Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining today. So, as you may already know, we have a series of special seminars on Korea, especially public and social policies of South Korea, with a generous fund and support from Korea Foundation. And today, I invited a special guest from South Korea again, Dr. Seung-hun Hong. Seung-hun. He's also a good friend of mine from my college years, and he's now serving very important position in South Korea. He's the director of the regulation policy in the Korean Institute of Public Administration. Well, other than that, he also served many different positions in and outside of Korea. So he also had experience teaching in universities, Australian National University, and also had a researcher positions in Korean Embassy in London, UK. And then now he is leading the Korean Institute of Public Administration in the topic of regulation policies. So it might be a bit unfamiliar for some of you about regulation and what is regulatory policies. But I'm sure that when you walk out this classroom after this presentation, you will be about a 25% expert in regulatory policies. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Hong, today's guest speaker.
Thank you, Hong-yun, for a very, kind introduction to me. As he introduced, my name is Seung-hun Hong, and I'm a director of regulatory policy at KIPA Korea Institute of Public Administration. And it's my honor and great pleasure to be here and presenting the Korean policy making in terms of regulation. And the title of today's presentation is Making Better Regulation in South Korea. So focusing on how the South Korean government has been working hard to make their regulations better, focusing on regulatory impact assessment or regulatory impact analysis. So I did my undergrad and MA in politics at Korea University and NYU, and my PhD in regulation and global governance at the Australian National University. And blah, blah, blah. Okay. I brought this photo. Do you recognize where I am, right? Okay, the first one. Yeah, you're right. Okay. This is from 2021 5G Territory Conference held in Riga, Latvia. And I presented, we actually discussed how we address the challenges of high-risk AI, and my point was we need to make regulations flexible as possible. Even though the flexible regulation is not the main topic of today's presentation, but the flexibility itself is actually at the core of what I present today. Okay. A little bit of Korea Institute of Public Administration. It is one of 26 public think tank affiliated with the National Research Council, which works under the Prime Minister's Office of the Republic of Korea. So the Korean government, actually, they don't have a research function. So when they have some demands of conducting research in terms of how to develop public policies, they go to one of those public policy think tank, and we are one of them. And Department of Regulatory Policy is one of 6 research bureaus of KIPA, and it is the nation's biggest regulatory research group comprising 8 fellows and 16 research associates. So we conduct many different research, and also we deliver lectures for central government, municipalities, public institutions, and international stakeholders like you, and support the government RIA, risk impact assessment, and PIL, post-implementation review. So, okay, and apart from other than that, in the last 3 years, my department has been leading the nation's digital transformation in regulatory information delivery. So we developed this AI-based system called Reg Navigator, and this is not the main topic of today, but might be next time. All right. Okay, let's start with the question: what is regulation? What do you think regulation is? Because everybody here might have different notions of regulation when it comes to the definition. Anybody? Mo. Horse. Sorry? Law. Okay, law. All right, important. And restriction. Thank you. Restriction. And who restricts whom? The state, the government restricts people, organizations, businesses. All right, good. And all right. Then, do you think this is regulation? Why? Okay. Speed limit is something that you need to comply, right? Which means that requires your compliance, right? And if you not comply, then it looks like there is some consequence, right? Okay, nice. What about this? It says 20 is plenty. Slower is safer. It doesn't look like restriction. So do you think it is also regulation, or you don't think it's regulation? Yes, why? Uh-huh. That's very, you mentioned very important words, directing people's behavior, right? Okay, nice, wow. 20 is plenty. Actually, if you think about the speed limit here, the same speed limit might apply in this photo, right? But the way the state or the government enforces the 20 miles or 20 kilometers per hour speed limit might be quite different, right? Okay. Law and regulation, which is very important, as you say. So, if you think about the relationship between law and regulation, so what do you think the relationship is? Which one is bigger? Law is bigger or regulation is bigger? Regulation is bigger? Okay, I need to delete this one. Okay, for you. Regulation is bigger? Why? So law is a way of introducing regulation to the public. Okay? Everybody agrees? Law is more binding. Okay, and is there anybody who thinks in the other way? Law is bigger than regulation? Nope. Okay. In broad sense, regulation is much bigger than law. I'll tell you why. But in narrow sense, regulation is part of law. This is quite different, and there's stark difference, right? And in real sense, if you look at the academic literature, you will find many regulatory scholars have used this broad sense of regulation. For example, John Braithwaite and Christian Parker. John Braithwaite is my PhD supervisor. He's one of the most respected regulatory scholars in the world. He's a professor at ANU, and Christian Parker is his earliest student and also professor at the University of Melbourne. In their 2004 article, they say it is regulation is steering the flow of events. Steering the flow of events. Do you imagine the situation? If you think about traffic or river flow, the water flow, then steering the flow is the core of regulation. It is what they argue. Second definition is by Julia Black at London School of Economics. She says regulation is intentional attempt to modify the behavior of others to produce specific outcome. As the gentleman back there says, is kind of direction, directing some people, other people's behavior. So what is important here is intentional attempt to modify. It is an attempt to modify someone else's behavior. If you think about if there are people who have kids, or you've been a kid, right, yourself. So when your parents say to you that, oh, you need to do something. I have kids, I have a son and a daughter, and they always play, video game. They always look at, their smartphone, watching YouTube. I don't like that. So I told them always, oh, could you please stop watching your smartphone and read books instead? And they don't listen to me. So I want to modify their behavior, right? How come? Do I have to smack them? Use my force? Or do I need to say that, oh, if you read books like 2 hours in a day for the next 7 days, I'll give you like $10 every day. Or I'll let you play with your smartphone every hour in a day. So there are different ways of modifying behavior of somebody else. In narrower sense, regulation is part of law, and this is actually accepted by many different governments. For example, in Korea, regulation means legal provisions that restrict, you're right, rights or impose duties on citizens in order for the state to achieve administrative objectives. So it is part of the law, and it has the function of restricting rights or imposing duties. So kind of a state command, right? You need to do these things. You shouldn't do this thing, right? In the UK, by UK government, the definition is pretty much similar, but a bit different. Legal provisions that impose or modify requirements, restrictions, conditions, or set or modify standards or guidelines. Do you recognize the difference between the two definitions? The Korean one only has restricting and imposing, right? But the UK definition has modifying, even though it is not imposing duty or restricting rights. If there's any change of the current regulation which is modifying the requirement, it is called regulation, okay? In Australia, things are quite different and very interesting. All government-approved rules expecting compliance. Can you tell the difference between the Australian definition and the first two definitions? Mm-hmm. Okay. Anybody else? if you think about the perspective of this definition, the Australian one is, to me, it seems like it reflects the perspective of regulatees. If you are a citizen or a business, there are government rules out there, and whatever they are, if they require or expect my compliance, right, it is regulation. So the Australian definition is from the perspective of regulatees, while the first two definition is pretty much like a government perspective, right? The US one is also different. General document that has the force of law and is created by a government agency, commissions, etc. This is also says the force of the law and is created by government agency, commission, which means that it's like law. It has the function of law, but it's not created by the parliament. Okay? It is called regulation. So in narrow sense, regulation is part of legislation or law. This is accepted or applied in many, many different countries, including South Korea. I don't know how things are in Kazakhstan. Do you have any definition of law or definition of regulation administrative system? Constitution. What does it say? Please email me after that, okay? All right. So, the broad sense of definition of regulation, regulation is a kind of process. It is a kind of steering the way people act, and it is kind of attempting, intentionally intervening with someone else's behavior, right? It's a kind of process. And in this definition, there is no government or state, right? Anybody can be the regulator. So regulatory authority can be anyone, and the important question is how to regulate. But in narrow sense, regulation is a rule, right? It's part of the law. Regulatory authority is state or the municipal government, and the important question is what are regulations, right? Okay. What I want to say today is regulation is a process. So you make regulation that is called regulatory rule making, and when the regulations are made, then it is enforced, right? It is enforced to people. So if you don't abide by the regulation, the state comes to you or the police officer comes to you and say, oh, you need to observe the traffic light, right? So this is regulatory enforcement. And if there is any absurdity or anything which is not, effective, then South Korea. There is this act called Framework Act on Administrative Regulation. It came into effect in February 1998, right after the Asian financial crisis. So the law itself was the result of the Korean government went bankruptcy. And the IMF came to South Korea and said, you need to put in place this Framework Act on regulation. So if you see the preamble of this Framework Act, it says, it is enacted to comprehensively and consistently abolish and overhaul various regulations such as licenses and permits that inhibit people's autonomy and creativity and reduce economic activities, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so if you ever look at this preamble, there's a clear perspective that's seeing that regulation is opposed to people's autonomy, individual autonomy, or individual creativity. Regulations hinder freedom and creativity or innovation in South Korea. So, Article 2 of this act say the term administrative regulation means restrictions on the rights of citizens or duties imposed thereupon by the state or local government to accomplish specific administrative objectives, blah, blah, blah. Okay. And the South Korean government have this register. How many of you can read Korean language? Okay. This is 국가법령정보센터, which means Korean Legislation Information Center. And if you go to this website, law.go.kr, then you will find, you can look up all the different legislation in South Korea. Let us see 도로교통법, which means a Road Traffic Act. If you look at the each article, there is a small signpost, right? If you say there is a 규제, you say there is a small rectangle with 규제 is regulation in Korean language, and this article is registered as a regulation. Okay, so for example, let's go through this. Okay. Okay, article number 5. This sets out the duty of following the signs or direction of the police officer and others. Okay, so the pedestrians or drivers of cars should or shall follow the direction of the police officer. So this sets out the duties of pedestrians or the drivers. So it is identified as 규제 or regulation. Okay. So next question is, how does Korea make regulations better? There is a system called regulatory impact analysis. It is recommended by OECD. So regulatory impact analysis or regulatory impact assessment means a tool or decision process for informing political decision makers on whether and how to regulate and to achieve public policy goals. So it is at the same time, it is tool and at the same time a decision process. It is not a decision-making process. It is a process informing decision-making of political actors. So as a tool, it is ensuring a systematic and rigorous process of identification and assessment of the potential impacts of government actions. So there are several different government actions to achieve a certain administrative goal, and you need to go through this regulatory impact analysis whether one particular option is better than the others. Okay? Elements of regulatory policy, such as public consultation, by developing a better understanding of the likely impact of regulatory options and communicating this to policymaker. So this is like, as I told you, speed limit 20. 20 is plenty. Probably the objective might be the same, right? You want all the drivers to keep your speed below 20 miles per hour. But the way that the state or the government enforce this regulation is quite different. Which one do you think is more effective? First one? Really? Second one? Anybody? Nobody? Is this one first? No? This one is first. This one is second. Okay. You think speed limit 20 is more effective? Why? Okay. But this one may also come with a penalty as well, right? Second one is recommendation. So from the perspective of drivers, while you drive and you see one of those signposts, which one would make you, much better, much more willing to keep the 20 mile per hour speed limit? First one. How many of you drive? Okay. What about you? First one. Everybody? Not sure. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. First one is very straightforward, right? Okay. Speed limit 20. You shouldn't go over this, right? Second one is like a recommendation, and it's like, oh, okay, 20 is planning, so I should reduce my speed. Okay, it's kind of a, how to say, persuading people. Oh, okay. There are different ways of exercising state power to modify people's behavior. One is like this one. Very straightforward command, right? You should attend all the classes. But your attendance to class is very much appreciated. Which one would you prefer? First? Really? Okay. Okay. Interesting. All right. Somebody would call that first one is rules-based regulation. And second one is principles-based regulation. But there's also debate between these two approaches, whether which one is more effective. And the question might be depending on situations or depending on the fields of regulation. And yeah, there might be people who prefer clear direction and clear command over this more like ambiguous recommendation by the state, right? But there are also people who may prefer like this one, because this is like using the state's monopoly of power in a more prudent way. Okay, so actually this one is from one of the United States state of, I don't recall exactly. Where is it from? Somewhere in the Midwest. Okay. Anyway, what I want to say here is regulatory impact assessment or analysis is like you need to think about the cost and benefit of these two options. So you need to think about the burdens of regulatees, and you need to make sure that which one is more effective or like imposing less burden to regulatees, right? So you need to think about it while you write this regulatory impact assessment. Okay. Regulatory rulemaking in Korea is a regulatory impact assessment or analysis is actually institutionalized in the Korean Act, Korean legislation. It says regulatory review. The head of a central administrative agency, including a central department,